Welcome to another episode of Corporate CPR, where we breathe life back into your organization, projects, and processes, giving you insights to recovery and avoiding corporate mortality events. Joining us today is Noah Gafni. Noah is the Executive Director for the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation and a Fellow of Social Innovation at Cambridge University. She's passionate about the intersection between social impact and diversity, equity, and inclusion, what she calls inclusive impact. Welcome, Noah. I'm so glad you could be here today. Anything else you'd like to say about yourself and your history?
Sure. So I started my career as a social entrepreneur, integrating young people and women into global conversations. I've lived and worked all around the world, working with the World Economic Forum, United Nations, and a number of other organizations on the next wave of thinking around diversity. So it used to be about how do we engage women in these conversations. Then it was really about young people. And then it was really about how do we bring different voices from the global south into the mix. And I think we're now at that next frontier of what's next for diversity, equity, and inclusion to make sure that all the voices are at the table when we're making big decisions.
Well, that's great because I think this will be an interesting topic. So there's a lot of talk about diversity inclusion, and one of the things even 10 years ago that always bothered me when it came up, we talk about race, gender, and 10 years ago it might have been religion, and I just like, but when you look at diversity, there's so many more categories. If I grew up, lower middle class, and somebody else grew up, upper class, our experiences are going to be vastly different. In fact, I see it between my husband and I. So, I was probably just middle class, but my husband, went to the private schools and all of that. So now he has network and connections that I never have. And those connections do so much to propel him forward in business versus me. I have almost no connections from high school, so just that makes a huge difference in how successful we are, or maybe how much work it takes him to get to the same result that it takes me. So would love to hear your thoughts on is that a problem that people bucket diversity into these very narrow buckets?
You're absolutely right. And it's also that these factors are interconnected. So I talk about 10 types of diversity. Race and ethnicity, of course, is a big one and one that's very much on everybody's mind right now. Gender, disability or ability, sexual orientation, and religion. Those are kind of the classic five that we think about nowadays. But there's also age, socioeconomic background, lived experience, political beliefs, and immigration status. And these are things that don't sit in silos, right? So unfortunately, when we look at wealth in the United States, there is a huge disparity between white families and Black families and other families of color. So when you talk about your husband's background going to the private schools and the ripple effect that that's had on the rest of his life, that's something which is so true for so many people. And it makes it really hard for individuals in different places in life to get to the top. And I think that's something that we're really struggling with right now is how do we make sure that we have real diversity and equity and inclusion in the room? Because, the seats of power, whether it's kind of in the CEO's office or in politics or even in places like the UN, there's less diversity than we should have up there.
So let's talk about some of those other factors. Well, I guess first I'd be curious on the I know it's Uber specific, but on the immigration status. And I assume that's a category partially because now you've got a foreign individual living in another country, whether they're an expat, illegal, migrant, or anywhere in between. Is that what you're talking about? And so is it because maybe there's a language barrier or cultural barrier, or?
There are language and cultural barriers, but these people see the US in a different way or wherever they're living, right? So actually entrepreneurs are more like, people who are coming from other countries are more likely to be entrepreneurs, which I think is something which is, something I find really fascinating and something that really adds to the people around us and the economy here. So I think there are so many examples of how being an outsider is actually an opportunity and something that we should integrate into organizations and not just think about in a theoretical way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spend part of my life in Australia, and Australia obviously is very close to the United States in the sense that we all speak English. We have a lot of the same religious history, a lot of the same, like how the country grew. A lot of that history is similar. Although I do find that since the U.S. rebelled and Australia didn't, there's actually a cultural difference around compliance. Um, but it is interesting, even though the countries are so similar. When I work in Australia, there are some things that are vastly different that I think and it's a two-way street. I know for me, I get really frustrated because I find that it feels like red tape everywhere, because they're so safety oriented and they're so employee oriented, and so like you're just blocked from doing a lot of things that might be the right thing to do, but because they're very safety oriented, it's not in their nature to do those things. But on the flip side, and I don't do this enough, there are things that they do that should be bringing back to the States. Like they do have a culture of like same as Europe in this regard, but taking longer breaks, and maternity leave is a
Mm-hmm.
year, things like that. So there's definitely, I think, some quality of life things that they have that could be brought back. So I guess what I'm saying is I see what you're saying about the importance of just where you're from brings new ideas.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you going over there brought new ideas over there, right? So it's
Mhm.
definitely an exchange, and it's something that when we think of immigration, it's such a hot button issue, and we think about it as how many people should we be bringing in? Where should we be bringing them in for? What kind of skills do they need to have? And actually, I think there's a much broader conversation that would be great to have around, wow, how great it is that other people want to come here and share their perspectives and areas of expertise with us and actually make our country richer. I think similar to political beliefs, which is another hot button issue that we really don't like to talk about. We often just shut it down without really asking the why underneath. Why are we so uncomfortable having these conversations, and why do people think differently from us, and how do we actually bring the best of what people have to say forward?
Yeah, I do. I do really think that, because I find that when I talk to people on the opposite side of the political spectrum and it's a one-on-one conversation, we can have very meaningful discussions and even find some common ground. And it's just really unfortunate that we struggle to scale that up
Mhm.
into actual politics. And I know the media doesn't help us, but politicians with the spin, they don't help us. But it's just really unfortunate because instead it's us versus them. It paints people in bad light when usually most people have good intentions. They're just approaching a problem a different way. And I think that's a little the case with, I guess, I love to talk to you about diversity inclusion. So first of all, I love to say that I like that you've expanded it, because it felt very like um, just checking a box when you're making it so narrow, because you're just like, oh, it's just these things, and it's like, well, there's so many other factors to people's life, as we've just talked about. So I really like that, and I do in a minute want to talk about well, no, let's start there. So how do you see then incorporating that into businesses?
So I think a lot of it is asking questions and breaking down barriers. So when we think about, it's exactly that, right? The tick the box exercise. When you apply for a job, nobody ever talks to you about it again. And then all of a sudden, maybe there's an employee resource group that you can volunteer to join in your spare time. Maybe there's a month that nods to your heritage, and the CEO will make a statement, right? But it's not really part of our day-to-day business culture. And there was a really interesting Harvard Business Review article that came out just a few days ago, I believe, and it's all about how Black employees don't necessarily want to go back into the office because of something called code switching, which means that when they go into an office, which is mainly a white work environment, they have to think twice about how they put themselves forward, right? So they may need to speak in a different way, or put themselves in a different type of tone of voice, or something that they wouldn't necessarily do with Black peers. And this need to switch back and forth all the time is exhausting, right? And so there are so many accommodations that people make when they go into the office, because it's an environment which is primarily dominated by white men who, mainly went to private schools and fancy universities. And, not that these people didn't have challenges in their lives, but the system is created in a way which is really focused on one type of person. And that makes it really hard for everybody else to fit in. And so when we're just treating it as a tick the box exercise, and we're not actually thinking about what does accommodating somebody else look like, then I think we're all missing out.
And so I guess where I struggle with this is the balance between what an individual should just suck it up and do versus what companies should do. And so, and I'll give you an example. Like you were talking about in different environments having to switch who you are. I have to. Not actually be, probably not the way you think. Not that, oh, I'm a female and so I have to, and so I'm doing something. Well, it is because I'm female, but not in the traditional sense. My problem is I have to tone it down, especially with women, right? Like if I go to my daughter's school and talk to the PT, I was part of the PTA. I have to often I'm probably on the other side of the spectrum politically. So I'd be very careful about the words I say in that group. I'm also not as empathetic is probably the wrong word, but we'll go with it. And so I am a little more like, people just need to get along and to move forward, like these things. So I'm always having to alter myself. So whether it's in PTA, whether it's in a room full of women, because, women find me abrasive, things like that. I'm always having to switch. So I think that's just part of life. So how much should we, but that said, we don't want to create hostile work environments. We don't want to create work environments where it becomes impossible to succeed because there's so many barriers. So how do we balance kind of that of like people just being a victim versus, we've created a hostile work environment and need to do something?
Sure. So I think we really need to look at it from a systemic lens. And it's one thing if an individual in a system feels uncomfortable, but if we see that there are patterns, then obviously that's pointing to a larger issue. And one of the patterns we're seeing right now is women dropping out of the workforce during COVID, right? So I think we're seeing the negative impact of what happens when a group of people isn't succeeding in the workplace in general, right? So it's not specific to an individual or a team or a company. It's actually a problem that we're facing nationally and internationally as well. And this is impacting the labor market overall, right? We're seeing that there's a shortage of people who are able to work in different positions, whether it's, in restaurants or in a CEO's office. And so I think this is something that, of course, people need to take personal responsibility, but also we need to look at, is the system set up so that so many people fail, right? And I think, your point about being judged for not fitting into an archetypal female stereotype is something that so many people feel, right? We know that women at work tend to be less liked when they are more assertive, right? And so I think that means that we're constantly needing to code switch as well. And so I think there's a lot there which is really challenging. And again, the onus is always on us as the people from diverse backgrounds or non-traditional backgrounds to accommodate. But at what point do we say, this way of working is only actually working for a very, very small group of people?
But how much responsibility should companies take, I guess? Because you're talking about, like, for instance, women leaving the workforce. And obviously, I guess you could come to different statistical conclusions on what the cause is. My presumption would be when COVID hit, kids were forced to do school at home. And the wife chose, or the mom, we don't know if she's married or not, but the mom chose to stay at home with the kid because there was no other childcare well, the government shut down the schools, right? So like, why, what is the company's responsibility there then?
Yeah. And these are difficult questions, but I
Mm,
think a company is trying, if we think about what companies are trying to achieve, let's take a consumer goods company, right? So we
mm,
know that women make 75% of household purchase decisions. We know that young people in particular in the United States are more likely to be diverse and people of color than previous generations. And in some states like California, they're minority white. So if you're a team of all white men marketing to people that you don't understand, that's a business risk, right? So I
mm.
think there are things that are just good for business when we take this inclusive approach. And oftentimes we look at it as, this is the nice thing to do, this is maybe the right thing to do. And it's also a very pragmatic thing to do as well, because if you don't have people around the table that you're trying to reach as a business, then you're not going to succeed.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I do think you need to, diversity and experience, diversity, and when you say diversity and experience, that can actually mean your ethnicity, your religion, et cetera, because all of that feeds into your experience. So I'm just going to go with diversity and experience brings a lot to the table, and especially like you were in your consumer goods example where who you're serving is a mix of people, and therefore you do need a mix of ideas in order to push that forward. So completely agree with that. How though, like I guess I've heard examples. Well, let's talk about within the company first before we're talking about new people coming on board. Let's talk about our pool of people we currently have and just assume we're not hiring or firing anybody. Um,
Mhm.
so we may have disproportionate at the moment, but what are some things that companies can do with the pool of people they have versus maybe knee jerk and like we got to go, on a hiring spree and fire some people and things like that? Like, so what do we do with who we've got? How do we make that? How do we maximize the diversity? We probably have some.
You have some, and I think in a traditional organization where people don't feel comfortable or people don't get promoted, you really have to think about, again, there are people in your pool already who have what it takes to succeed. I'll give you another example. So, I obviously work at a public university, and it's an outstanding public university, and our students are very diverse. A third of them are the first in their families to go to college. The campus I'm on, it's a minority white campus. We're based in Newark, New Jersey. A lot of our students have been untraditional students or faced challenges in the past. And so, unfortunately, some companies will only hire from Ivy League schools, right? And so, or they'll hire they'll only hire people from Ivy League schools for their front of house roles, right? So students like mine are in an organization, but they're not always the first in line for a promotion or for that front of house role. And that's such a shame because I think they're just as bright. They just don't have that tick on the box in their resume. And that's something that so many companies are overlooking. And it's such an easy thing to do. You have really bright people in your organization who may not necessarily look or have the same exact credentials as the people that are, in that high potential program, but that doesn't mean they're not high potential, right?
So where, I mean, so that's not, I guess, congruent with what I've seen, and in the sense that, I know it's true. But I guess I'm wondering if it's pockets. Sorry, let me be specific. So when you're talking about people having the experience and having the ability to succeed, but they don't fit, whether they didn't go to the right school or they're not the right race or whatever the case may be, and that's preventing it. I feel like I guess I struggle with that a little because I've seen a lot of if the person is qualified, it actually all goes out the window. If they've got results, nobody seems to care. Where I guess I feel from my perspective, just this is anecdotal of what I've seen, right? Not studies. It's a lot about who you know. So that's
Mhm.
where the private schools and all of that become important because, like my first job in my career came from me spending time volunteering at the local Project Management Institute chapter. And so I had to put in, I mean, I was qualified and I couldn't get a job because I didn't have experience, right? So it kind of like your college students that you're talking about. Obviously, I probably have less, from a diversity and inclusion perspective, have less of the challenges maybe that they do. I didn't go to a great school either, though. But so I went, so I'm volunteering for PMI. Somebody there was hiring, and because they knew me, because I spent time on the board, they gave me the chance. So I feel like it's, I guess what I'm trying to solve in my head, or reach to this, I'm headed towards this conclusion, is how much of maybe the diversity and inclusion challenge has to do with our networks, meaning we're not networking with the people who make decisions. And so maybe we need to change the way networking happens. I don't know. I just came to that just now. So
I think networking is a big part of it. And I think when you go to a private school and you're learning how to network from day one, you're much better at it too, right? You kind of know what to talk about. I have a friend who went to a historically Black college, and one of the things that they did there was talk to the women college students about how do you network and how do you talk about sports and golf and all of these things that traditionally people will talk about in a networking setting. And again, if you're not from that world and you don't know who's golfing this weekend, is it Tiger Woods? I don't even know who it is right now, but I think it's kind of do you speak the language? And ultimately, unfortunately, people hire those they feel really comfortable with. And oftentimes that means that it's the person that looks and sounds most like you or has a lot in common with you. And so when you come from a different background, people are sometimes more hesitant to not give you the benefit of the doubt, right? So, another example, when I went to a great school. I went to Dartmouth, which is an Ivy League school. And I think I got a lot more credit than I deserved when I was in the job market in my early 20s, right? So
well, yeah, you
people
went to
were willing to.
Dartmouth. Well, yeah, somebody sees that. I mean, I do that too. Wow, they went to Dartmouth. It's this mystery, like, to those of the people who've been there, there's kinship, and for those of us who haven't been there, it's this like, wow, that's amazing. They must be brilliant.
I don't know. I went to college with some people who were brilliant. I went to college with some people who weren't, right? And I think even when we look at Ivy League schools, it's a network of people whose primarily parents went to Ivy League schools, or parents were very wealthy. And so I think we can't ignore that side of the equation either. So I think I got a note from somebody saying, I think it's 20% of students at Ivy League schools come from the top 20%, and more, or 50%, and then the rest only come from the bottom 80, right? So I'll have to check that stat. But it really is, a very, very stark difference between the students who go and can afford to go and can afford all of the tutoring and extracurricular activities and everything that you need to do to get there. It's a system that's, it's not an equitable system, right? So it's
Well, but pause there, because you just said it's, there's people who can't do everything you need to do to be able to get there, and so it's like, but why is that the school's problem? Meaning, sorry, let me take this a little, just add a little to it. Meaning, if I'm doing it, let's say when I look at resume or entrance exam or entrance paperwork, I'm only looking at grades, whatever their standard things are, and maybe I'm putting in some pieces that help people who don't do well on standardized tests. Maybe I've got some things to help normalize the data presented in front of me. But if I'm making a numeric decision and I'm not considering any race, gender, anything, like, why isn't that fair? It's not me as an institution. It's not my fault whether or not you could afford tutoring, let's say. So tell me
So
your
I
thoughts there.
think it's a really interesting point. I think oftentimes we see a lot of students that have equal grades and equal SAT scores, but they don't necessarily have the I volunteered in Africa one summer, with elephants. I think, that's the kind of, or my parents didn't donate $20,000 a year for the past 18 years so that I could get this seat. So that's where
So
I
like
think it
low
really
quality
comes down
system.
to, it's a system which is unfortunately that plays a really big role. And so it's really hard for us to say, but on the other hand, when you're a company and you're hiring, you can look at grades in college, regardless of institution, and say, oh, this person had a 4.0 GPA. I mean, they must be really smart, right? So I think there are ways that you can look at it. And of course, numbers matter to an extent, but I think it's, so many of these decisions are really subjective, and we're not as rational as we like to think we are.
No, yeah, and I completely agree. It's not a good system if we are taking students of equal intelligence and we're penalizing them for all these extras. Because and I think that's part of the thing is that schools have become much bigger than what they used to be. Like they've made their purpose, I guess, maybe, I don't know the term, sometimes a little more grandiose than the simple, we're here for higher learning. Why does it matter what donations have been made or where I volunteered? Like if I'm so focused on being the next Einstein, does volunteering really matter? Like, I mean, like, from a school's perspective, right? So anyway, but let's
Well, on
I
the point of volunteering, actually, this is a really interesting one. 40% of internships are unpaid. So you're basically volunteering your time as an intern. And if you're not coming from a background where you can afford to take a summer off and not work, you have a part-time job, you have a full-time job, you have parents, kids, things that you need to contribute to, you're paying your own rent. This is, and a lot of times we're looking at, oh, well, we hire our interns, but if you're not paying your interns, that you're not really willing to bring in people with different backgrounds, because it's, you're excluding so many people in the process.
Oh, absolutely. And the people who had to work multiple jobs in the summer or whatever may have far more hustle and maybe have far more work ethic than
Hmm.
the people who got to go intern for free. And actually, that was the answer that I had. A lot of people are like, "Would you have done anything different in school?" And I said, "I would intern. I'd find a way to intern because like that, makes a huge difference in what doors get open to you."
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, so we talked about like well let's I think we could dig into it a little more, but with my pool of people that I already have, again, not hiring or firing right now, what other things can I do to create, ensure that I'm tapping into that wealth of diversity within my organization?
So I think a lot of it is rethinking what you're actually looking for in a job description when you're looking to promote somebody. I think it's really about reaching across the organization. Again, we're so focused on the pool of 100 high potential, talented people, talented in quotes, right? That fit all of the traditional metrics of what we're looking for. So I think it's about looking outside the organization, outside of that part of the organization. And I think it's also about empowering other people to step up, right? So once they're in an organization, are you taking their ideas seriously? Are you listening to them? Are there channels for other people other than this group of high potential middle managers to reach the CEO and the C suite, right? So I think it's a lot about, are you creating empowerment opportunities so that you can see who's actually already stepping it up in the organization or who wants to step it up in the organization, right? Because it's so hierarchical across so many organizations that you might have somebody really great in your supply chain function and not even know it.
Yeah, I was wondering if maybe you create, projects with committees or something where you reach across to multiple different. Oftentimes when committees are created, it's like maybe they'll go to each department and they'll take, whoever the most senior person is. But maybe that's not the answer. Maybe it's let's take, let's create a diverse, committee to give us input on this topic. I don't know. What are your thoughts? Have you seen that?
I have seen that, and I think it's oftentimes people will be nominated to these committees, and again, that's kind of that circular thinking of we know who those high potential people are already, instead of giving people that open-ended, "Do you want to do this?" And also, how do you frame it in a way that people from different backgrounds will feel like they're qualified so that they do put themselves forward, right? Because I think it goes back to your piece in the beginning around private schools and networking and put yourself forward. And that's something that comes very naturally to some people and not all. And I think we have to be really mindful of um, when we think about, are these opportunities, are people encouraged to put themselves forward, even if they're not in that one box or another?
So I guess how do we break that cycle? And that, part of the reason the way I am is because my mom really pushed me to be independent. I mean, some of it's just born with it, right? But when you talk about then some of the skills, my mom was while she's an extrovert, she's extremely quiet, meek type of, humble person, right? So she's not I'm going to go put myself out there. So she didn't teach me that so much, but she did push a lot of independence, like going to university wasn't an option. I didn't even know you got a choice, right? It was just this was going to happen. She didn't finish, but I was going to go. And so, with my daughter, now obviously she has a further role model around independence and trying new things, and I put her in different activities so that she gets these experiences, and she gets a lot of experiences I never had because my parents were very middle class. Like it was you go play outside, and like I didn't get to do dance like all through growing up as a lot of people did. I didn't get lessons. I didn't get it was all very simple. And so I guess where I'm headed with this is there's skills that are important, courage. How do you teach courage? But courage, public speaking, and overall communication capabilities. How do you present yourself? Because all of those things factor into what you're saying is where we get into these loops of we're not looking maybe into other groups because maybe they aren't eloquent, or maybe they slouch, or maybe they come into work, not dressed the way we think they should be dressed. So how do we, like, I guess, maybe a twofold answer or approach, but how do we help get to kids younger, or universities, or maybe the organization even has some sort of training, but how do we do that? Because some things are important, like being able to convey an idea, is important in business. So being well spoken is really especially as you move up. I talk to CEOs and I feel inadequate. Like part of my job, I talk to a lot of CEOs and CIOs, and they're just on this whole nother level of, vocabulary and communication that even I'm not there. So what do we do? What are your thoughts?
So I think when we talk about the skills, people from all backgrounds have great skills, right? So I think there's not necessarily a skills gap. When you say, tell me about a time when you did this, right? In an interview, or when you're thinking of promoting somebody and you're looking through their annual review. If you're going to somebody that's a diverse candidate from, again, a lower socioeconomic status, and they spent COVID hustling to make ends meet. They were an Uber driver and working at a supermarket, and they're, like, their definition of they may not want to talk about what they did in that way, right? So I think, how do you make somebody feel comfortable so that you can show those examples of grit and resilience and willing to get things done in a way that makes them feel comfortable, right? Because I think oftentimes we look at those roles in maybe not the most positive way, but when we think about an individual who is going to school and trying to make ends meet, and working two jobs at the same time, that is very, very impressive, right? And I think we could all agree. So how do we ask the right questions in order to make people feel comfortable answering? I think it's also, how do we acknowledge that there are some structural barriers? For example, the internships point that we made, or the Ivy League schools, things like that, which I think we just take for granted when we're looking at somebody like that. And are you looking at somebody's watch when they come in for an interview of what brand it is, right? I think there's a lot of work that we need to do as executives in order to really rethink what our assumptions are. So I think that's a really, really big piece of the puzzle.
But I guess, I wonder how much is just the easy path, going back again to networking. Because, for instance, when I need to hire somebody, the first thing I do, because I have to hire them quickly, is I go ask everybody I know, do you know somebody who does this? And then they send me referrals and stuff. And so those are the people I interview. So again, my resumes that I get are a reflection of the network that I have, and then the network that those people have. And so, we end up, and obviously I'm a small company, but we end up with majority of women just because of how the network is, right? Like, we find more women being employed here than men. And so I just wonder if it's so much this default to what's easy. Because if I wanted to go, for me personally beyond that, then I have to do a couple of things. One, I have to slow down the speed of which I need to hire. For us, we're consulting, so it's a lot to do with how fast the client needs. But and then two, I have to go take this time to go find now new ways to find people. So maybe it's posting on LinkedIn, maybe it's whatever, to get a whole bunch of more resumes. And of course, I'm going to have to filter through them all. And it's going to require, right? So, and all of that's important. So I'm not saying that, but what it seems to me is I think maybe a lot of people default to what's easy and quick is where I was headed with that. And we've got to change that mentality, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're wired to create shortcuts in our mind.
Yeah.
And so wherever we can do that, we do that, but then we miss out because we're not bringing the best team that we can bring to the table. And that's where I think we need to think about diversity differently, because it's not the people who aren't coming to the table that are missing out. Yes, and so are we, because we're not getting those insights and we're not getting the best from the people that we already have in our organization that we may not be thinking of or listening to. And I think that's really what it comes down to. Is this is a really good idea for business, right? This makes businesses more successful. It makes society more successful. And so we really need to invest in it. And that takes a lot of psychological undoing of, okay, well, this is my shortcut. I need to hire somebody for this project that starts next week. But you and other organizations, when we take those shortcuts often and consistently, we're missing out.
Absolutely. And I guess, the key there is if you're not going to be able to change the speed in which, like, if you have to hire quickly or whatever, then you need to find ways to be proactively bringing those people in. For instance, one thing we're trying to do, still in its infancy, is create like a talent pool of people who might be interested in working for us if it becomes the right thing. And we go talk to them ahead of time and go find them ahead of time, so that then when the time comes, it's much quicker for us to, bring somebody on. So companies could be doing that. So making sure that they're being proactive in creating a diverse talent pool, of people they know would love to work for them. I guess the same could happen in the company, right? Like, where, who's interested in doing what, and let's keep kind of the pulse on people across the organization, so when an opportunity comes up, we have a better way of asking who would like to be involved in it. So maybe it's just what you said, it's investment.
Absolutely. I think you just have to invest across the board. You have to invest in yourself, you have to invest in your people, and you have to invest in new ways of doing things, right? Processes, questions to ask during interviews. A lot of that comes down to small steps you can take, but they have a dramatically different impact.
Yeah. And so, if corporations don't pay attention to this, obviously they have the potential of losing ground with their consumers, because they're not representing their consumers. They might be missing out on great ideas and new ways of doing things that make them more competitive. And then just, overall, like, business people learn this all the time, this concept of making sure that you are well-rounded in your organization, because that well-roundedness brings strength and stability. So obviously diversity plays into all of that. But it's a huge topic. So Noah, tell me, it's been really interesting, but we're kind of coming up on time. And so maybe we've talked about some things, maybe we haven't. What are kind of your 3 tips though for organizations when it comes to, diversity and inclusion? You can bring up something we haven't discussed. That's fine too, because it's such a huge topic.
Yeah, so I think the first is obviously think through that multiple diversities lens, right? So there are 10 types of diversity and they're pretty interrelated. So if you think about socioeconomic status and race together, then you start thinking about this in a more holistic way, and it gives you a better picture of where your gaps are. The second thing is to, again, ask different questions and think about processes that can enable you to not just hire new people that have more diverse backgrounds, but actually look at your organization in a way that shows who is in the room that actually has a lot of potential that you might have overlooked previously. And then the third thing I think is really around what we talked about with those mental shortcuts. How do we challenge our own assumptions and unconscious biases and really think through, how are we maybe making decisions over and over again that just reflect our own comfort? And so I think that's something that, again, it's work that we all need to do and something that we really need to think about critically.
Yeah, those are great tips. Well, Noah, do you have any resources you'd like to recommend, or if people want to get in contact with you, is there a way they can do that?
Absolutely. We do a lot of this work at the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. So please feel free to check out our website and our insights on that page. And feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, whatever you like.
Well, thanks so much for being a guest today.
Thank you so much, Jenna. It was really fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and to our audience, until next time, keep your organizations healthy.